Hey friends. So in this video, we're going to talk about the first concept in the reading, right? The heart or heart mind. And so what I want to do is hit a few of the major ideas and contrast them with what we find in the Cartesian package. So the first thing we see is that the heart mind is the faculty of thought and emotion. So right away, we see something different here from what we find in Descartes. For Descartes, uh, thought and emotion are two different things governed by different faculties, right? Governed by different processes, different mechanisms in the individual. Whereas in the Confucian tradition, thought and emotion are controlled by the same faculty, right? By the same psychological mechanism. So what that means is that there is no siphoning off thought from emotion. Now, the heart mind is capable of choice, or rather, we are capable of choice in virtue of having, right, in virtue of this heart or heart mind. So we're not determined, but there's an important qualifier here. In the Confucian tradition, what we find is a willingness to excuse responsibility, provided there are clear external factors shaping the agent's behavior. Right? So the individual is responsible, but it's sort of built into the worldview that external conditions affect choices we make. Now, our heart mind is something that's able to be cultivated, to be grown, right? To be shaped. And this leads to a kind of independence, right? Importantly, it's an independence in establishing the correct direction for our lives. So again, we get a view here that's importantly different from what we find in the Cartesian package. So we're able to cultivate this capacity for choice, right? We're able to cultivate our emotions, our thoughts. What's the point of the cultivation? To figuring out the correct direction of your life. Now, you might ask yourself, what determines the correct direction of my life? So, on a Cartesian view, that would come from inside, right? It would be an internal force or an internal guide, right? You have to determine the correct direction of your life. Descartes doesn't say that, right? Just to be clear. However, it's easy to see how a Cartesian would get there. Now, in the Confucian tradition, what determines the correct direction of your life isn't something inside you, but it's the network of moral, ritualistic, and cultural factors that you're a part of. So the correct direction of your life is shaped in part by the network of relationships you find yourself in. Now, what we find again in the Confucian tradition is that this leads to freedom. So again, we might ask ourselves, why is it that finding the correct direction in our lives would lead to freedom? Well, it doesn't lead to freedom in the sense that Descartes wants us to think of freedom. Right? Remember, Descartes thinks that we are absolutely free. And the metaphysical view behind this is that we are mental substances that do not exist in the physical world, which means that we aren't bound by the laws of physics. So freedom in this case is simply part and parcel of our existence. For Descartes, you are free because you exist. For Confucians, we have to develop this kind of freedom, right? We have to, or rather, we have to sort of make our way towards this freedom. And we make our way towards this freedom by cultivating the heart mind to get us to the correct direction in our lives. So again, this sounds like a peculiar notion of freedom. It's not the kind of freedom we're used to. But nonetheless, it's a kind of freedom from having to effectively, or it's a kind of freedom to live as you should be living, right? Which again contrasts with our Western notion of freedom, or with a Cartesian notion of freedom, in which freedom is simply being unconstrained by anything really. Um, it's right in the Confucian tradition, freedom is more about doing what you should be doing. Now, the goal then is a kind of moral self-transformation. So we cultivate the heart, or the heart mind, in order to um, transform ourselves into the best versions of ourselves. And the best versions of ourselves are the versions of ourselves that are doing what we should be doing within our networks, right? Within our groups, within our societies. Now, what's interesting is that you might think to yourself, okay, but what about the problem of free will and determinism, right? Is any individual free in their behaviors, right? Or are they determined? And for Confucians, this is just not an issue, right? They were concerned about responsibility and they're concerned about choice. But it doesn't seem like there's a big concern for the free will determinism paradigm that we have in Western philosophy. Rather, the questions are about how do we cultivate individuals into becoming the best versions of themselves, right? And so when we ask about whether or not you're free to do this, the assumption is that we are free. It's just trying to understand how we do this. So in other words, freedom and responsibility at the level of individuals is not really a question in the Confucian framework, right? It's just a non-issue. And so I want to highlight that is another important difference between the Confucian tradition that we have here and the Cartesian tradition, right? Um, excuse me. The difference is that on the Cartesian view, individual responsibility is an important question to sort out, right? Whether we're free or whether we're determined. And in the Confucian tradition, that's just not a question that pops up, right? The concepts are different. And so the resulting philosophical problems are different. And so for me, at least, it's really interesting to think that different cultural frameworks, different philosophical viewpoints generate different kinds of philosophical problems, and problems that we might have in the Western tradition don't necessarily show up in other traditions.